Well, I think all of you, or most of you, have seen this NASA propaganda before. The rocket that we love to hate, the SLS. But no matter how much we might dislike this overpriced, outdated rocket, it may indeed be the rocket that we're stuck with, at least for the moment, because in spite of recent reports or rumors that the SLS was about to go away, Jim Bridenstine set the record very straight. Quote, landing the first woman and the next man on the moon is just the beginning of NASA's Artemis program. The SLS is a crucial part of sustaining missions to the moon. NASA's goal is to take what we learn living and working on the moon and use it to send humans on the first missions to Mars, unquote. But if stated objectives are met, and take that statement with a whole lot of grains of salt, the Starship will go to orbit sometime in 2021, whereas the SLS will orbit the moon in 2021. Like it or not, I believe that this rocket stands a very good chance of taking humans to the moon first, before the Starship is ready for the task. And this, of course, is unfortunate because the SLS is by far an inferior ship and is not the ship for the future of human exploration of the solar system. But for the short term, it does have some advantages over the Starship. It is a simpler rocket. It utilizes technology that we're already familiar with. As a matter of fact, the damn thing should have been flying years ago. It's so simple. And that's one of the things that pisses me off so much about it. But nevertheless, because it is so straightforward compared to the complexity of the Starship, I think it's very likely that it will get to the moon first. So if we're going to get stuck with this thing, it's also likely that it's going to be the rocket that's going to kill the Artemis project as much as it's going to drive it, because of its expense, because of its inefficiency, and because almost none of it is reusable. But what if some of it was? What if somehow we could make a few modifications to reduce the price and make this thing more modern? Could we fix the SLS? Good evening, and welcome to another episode of The Angry Astronaut. So, after watching that little intro, I'm sure some of you are wondering whether or not Boeing has put something in this coffee cup and has converted me into an SLS fan. Well, let me assure you that is not the case. I still despise Boeing. I still think the SLS is one of the most wasteful ways that we can get human beings to the moon or any place else. And I still feel that the entire plan puts the Artemis project at risk. Nothing has changed as far as that's concerned. And as far as the Starliner is concerned, I feel even worse about that. I feel that that needs to be canceled and we need to replace it with the Dream Chaser, but I've talked about that many times before, so I'm not going to rehash that. What brought this on was a conversation that I had with one of my Twitter followers, and I just happened to notice that he was an SLS advocate. So after picking my jaw up off the floor, I sent him a DM and said, "You're very courageous to express your opinions, especially given how many people hate the SLS, including myself." And he said, "Thank you very much." I'm still kind of confused as to why he follows me, but I'm very glad that he does. So I told him that, I would have a little bit more of a look at the SLS, kind of keep up with what was going on with it. And it led me to think, since Jim Bridenstine recently has said that the SLS is going to be the ship for NASA to take humans to the moon anyway, and that we aren't planning on abandoning it anytime soon, at least contrary to some reports that have been out lately. Jim Bridenstine seemed to want to put those reports to rest. So what I wondered was, what would I do if I were Jim Bridenstine right now? Would I throw all the money I had at SpaceX and at Elon Musk and try to get the Starship done? Probably not, because Elon Musk is moving forward as fast as he possibly can as it is. And honestly, I don't think Congress would give me the money to throw out all my eggs into one basket anyway. Would I start with a new ship from scratch? Probably not, given the fact that NASA's already invested over $20 billion in this damn thing so far. And we're so close to the finish line, or at least we appear to be. Probably wouldn't do that either. But what I might do is see if there is a way that I might be able to make it better, make the rocket less expensive in the long run, add some kind of reusability, and make it a rocket that's going to launch at least twice a year instead of once a year under the current plan. How would I do all of that? Well, we're going to find that out right now. So if I was Jim Bridenstine, first of all, I'd be grateful for my salary and for my pension and for my medical care program that most people don't have. And then I'd get on to what I had to work with the SLS and have a look at the Block 1. The Block 1 is also called the Big Orange Rocket because it's the same color as the orange insulation that they use for the liquid hydrogen and oxygen fuel. At first, they painted it white to protect it from ultraviolet light on the space shuttle, but when this was found to be unnecessary, then they removed the paint, saving 600 pounds of weight and still having the same protection for the fuel. Now, the thrust is provided by 4 upgraded RS-25 engines, whereas the shuttle had 3 and 2 solid rocket boosters, again like the space shuttle, except upgraded in terms of their power. And there's the most recent test of the solid rocket boosters, and these things, I have to admit, are pretty damn incredible. Each of these boosters provides 3.6 million pounds of thrust, or roughly 70% of the thrust of a Falcon Heavy. So 2 of these boosters provide 1.4 times as much power as the Falcon Heavy, and that's just the boosters. The boosters are manufactured by a company called Orbital ATK, whereas the RS-25s are manufactured by Aerojet Rocketdyne. And between the 2 of them, they can generate 8.8 million pounds of thrust at launch, or roughly 10% more than the Saturn V. So using space shuttle technology and without any refueling, the SLS is capable of lofting a heavy ship like the Orion all the way to the moon without any refueling. Some people would call this Space Shuttle Plus, but I call it Space Shuttle Minus, because although the Space Shuttle tried to reuse all of this technology, the SLS lets all of it burn up in the atmosphere, as I think you know. Now, the rest of the SLS's propulsion is provided by what's called the ICPS, or Interim Cryogenic Propulsion Stage, which is based on a ULA Delta IV rocket. And then on the right are 4 RL-10 engines manufactured by Aerojet Rocketdyne for future versions of the SLS that will be exploring beyond the moon, or so the theory goes. And these 4 engines provide the thrust for the Exploration Upper Stage, or EUS, or 97,000 pounds of thrust for the Block 1B. This theoretically allows 38 tons to be sent to deep space, or more than 42 tons worth of cargo to be sent to the moon. And so it goes until you cap out at the Block 2, which has 9.5 million pounds worth of thrust and is capable of delivering 43 tons in crew mode to translunar injection, or 48 tons in cargo mode, either again to deep space or to translunar injection, essentially to the lunar gateway. Now, an SLS advocate might say that you can deliver all this mass without all that orbital refueling, and here's another advantage. The SLS has an abort system built in to protect the crew, something that the Starship lacks, at least in its current design. So, the SLS can deliver payload without having to refuel. It doesn't require any radical new technology, and it has an abort system. A lot of advantages, really, one would think. One would also think that this thing would already be done, given how basic the technology is. But even if the SLS was done, it's going to be wasted every time it's launched, which means that NASA is planning only one visit to the Lunar Gateway per year. And even with SpaceX's resupply of the Lunar Gateway, we can only expect astronauts to stay there for a maximum of 6 months, and that would really be pushing it. So that means half the time under the current plan, the Lunar Gateway will be unoccupied, not a continuously inhabited station, not going to the moon to stay, and that is a recipe for failure. So how do you fix or even improve this situation to make a rocket that costs $1 to $2 billion to launch every time, on top of the rest of the expenses with Artemis, any better? How are you going to make this thing last? Well, your first step would be to bring in an outside consultant. Okay, so that would involve telling these guys to take their and ram it in their, because over the last 15 years, they've made it really clear that they can't get a thing right. That felt good. So even though these guys would be an obvious choice for reusability, their model would not fit the SLS very well, in my opinion, because it involves reserving fuel in order for the ship to land itself, which the SLS can't afford to do if it wants to get the kinds of cargo that it's carrying out to the moon. And of course, the same kind of reusability is used by these guys. Plus, if you want to take another 15 years getting your rocket properly modified, then yeah, this is the company for you. Now, this one may be a bit of a shocker for you because, after all, ULA is a bit of a spin-off from Boeing itself. However, that was an extremely long time ago, and their idea for reusability actually is a pretty good match for the SLS. But, of course, there'd probably have to be some sort of clause saying that anybody who worked for Boeing couldn't be part of the team, or something like that. Then again, why does it have to be an American company? These guys are also working on reusability, and as you will see shortly, the Europeans have some pretty interesting ideas when it comes to reusing engines. So maybe these guys as well, or maybe a collaboration between them and ULA. In any event, let's get on to the modifications. So the first area that I would concentrate on is the RS-25 engines. Now, according to Aerojet Rocketdyne, the cost of repurposing these engines for reuse is actually more than building the engines themselves. However, a recent audit shows that NASA is paying $145 million per engine. Now, these engines are incredibly reliable in all the uses of the space shuttle. All the times that the engines got reused, these things never failed once. But if Aerojet Rocketdyne expects us to believe that it costs up more than $145 million to repurpose an engine, they can go and yeah, this video has me especially angry, but in any event, this is why we need an outside consultant, because clearly these companies are taking advantage of government procurement. So if we could somehow save these engines during the launching process, we would save $580 million, and if we could somehow repurpose them at about $10 million a piece, which is way more than what SpaceX charges to repurpose an engine, then we would still be saving over $500 million on these 4 engines alone. But how the hell would we do this? Well, the answer, believe it or not, comes from ULA. And the reason I'm saying this is because of what ULA is planning to do with their Vulcan rocket. Now, this is a couple of years off, but nevertheless, it involves the use of something called a hypersonic inflatable aerodynamic decelerator. So the engines separate from the rocket, and then essentially an inflatable heat shield deploys and the rocket re-enters the atmosphere, decelerating as it goes for quite a distance before a parafoil deploys after that. And the parafoil is capable of supporting as much as 40,000 pounds worth of weight, which is far in excess of what the RS-25 has. And then a helicopter retrieves the engine. And by the way, ULA is using this method to retrieve the BE-4 engine, which ironically is made by Blue Origin, and it's much less expensive than the RS-25. So if this method works with this particular engine, it's definitely going to work with something like the RS-25, at least in terms of cost effectiveness. And I also find it pretty funny that ULA is going to send up a rocket with a Blue Origin engine before Blue Origin does. So we've saved about $500 million so far. Where else could we possibly cut some costs? And by the way, whoever the outside contractor is, they only get paid, or rather they get paid bonuses, if their methods actually save money. No more of this blank check nonsense. So the next obvious target would be the solid rocket boosters, and the space shuttle did reuse these things, but unfortunately they landed in the ocean, and by the time you repurposed them and got all the salt water out and accounted for all the damage that the salt water did, it ended up being more expensive to repurpose one of these things than to build a new one. And in this case, I don't think that that's a load of nonsense. And incidentally, the dry weight of one of these things is 100 tons, which is far beyond the capacity of any helicopter, so you can't do it with a helicopter either, like with the RS-25s. But these things are also very reliable. As a matter of fact, Orbital ATK is already using some of the parts from the old space shuttle boosters in order to make the SLS boosters. So what can we do about this? Well, one possible solution is to get Orbital ATK, boy that's tough to say, and everybody else concerned to embrace what Relativity Space is doing, and that is 3D printing rocket parts. This method could reduce the upfront costs of just about everything on the SLS. But what happens if all these companies lawyer up and haul out their contracts and refuse to change? Well, if I were Jim Bridenstine, it would be time for NASA to play hardball and simply say that we will never do business with any of you guys ever again if you don't do something to bring your costs down. You've had your chance to take advantage of government pork for too long, and now it's time to pay the piper. Now, as far as reusing the boosters is concerned, we have to remember that these things come in a variety of segments. Might it be possible to save the most expensive parts of the boosters, say the avionics or something along those lines, by catching them the same way that SpaceX catches falling fairings from the Falcon 9? It might be possible. I'm certainly no expert, but it would be worth looking into. Now, another reusability system is called the Adeline, which comes from a European company called Airbus and is being designed for the Ariane 6 for the European Space Agency. And the idea is, as you can see, is that the Adeline detaches from the rocket, re-enters Earth's atmosphere at 5 times the speed of sound with the engines behind the wings and a heat shield. And then once it's in the atmosphere, it uses its wings to fly towards a runway, obviously under computer control. And then once it gets down to subsonic speeds, it uses deployable propellers to power the rest of its return and get to the landing site, where eventually it touches down using skids. There are a lot of different ways to skin this cat, and in my opinion, it's in our interest, in NASA's interest, and in the interest of the SLS to look at all of them. But an SLS advocate is going to invariably say that all of these modifications are going to add extra weight, thus defeating the purpose. But there's a solution for that as well. What if we put nuclear thermal engines in the universal stage adapter for the later versions of the SLS instead of the chemical rockets that are currently being planned? The first tests of nuclear thermal power are supposed to be taking place in 2024 anyway, when we're getting the first boots on the moon. Now, nuclear thermal engines might add additional cost, but given how much Aerojet Rocketdyne has been charging for their chemical engines, I kind of doubt it. And I already did an episode about this, but this type of engine is a minimum of 2 to 3 times as efficient as a chemical rocket, easily making up for any added weight that we put onto the first stage. It uses liquid hydrogen as a propellant, just like the SLS, and this can be manufactured on the moon, meaning that it could make use of lunar fuel depots. Now, this same propulsion could be used to drive the Mars base camp, which I've covered in another episode, which I have linked at the end of this video, driving the human race to Mars in as little as 3 months. Now, does this mean that I've suddenly become an SLS fan and I think that this is the way to get to Mars? Of course not. But if the worst does happen and the Starship doesn't work out, or we have to wait for it, then we definitely need to look for other options, and this certainly represents a few of them. So, probably the first question that may be occurring to a lot of you folks is any of this possible? Could any of this happen? Well, probably not. Probably NASA's just going to stay the course with this project as it is. But honestly, if Jim Bridenstine wants to go to the moon to stay, then he sure as hell better start considering some options. Because if he goes to the moon once a year with the SLS and leaves the Lunar Gateway unoccupied at least half of the time, there is a real chance that this entire project is going to get shut down, and all of NASA's ambitions, not only on the moon, but also to Mars and beyond, are also going to be shut down. And this time it's going to be a lot more consequential, given the fact that there are other countries like the Chinese and the Russians that have real ambitions here. Shut down Artemis and you open up space to the rivals of the ESA and NASA at the very least. Not to say that they'll necessarily do something awful with it, but they could. And is that something we really want to take a chance of? So the current plan of just going to the moon once a year, it's just not going to work. Eventually, NASA's going to get sick of it. We need to keep the Lunar Gateway occupied 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, as we currently do with the ISS. That's what's kept the ISS going for the last 20 years because nobody wants to deorbit something that's been constantly occupied all this time. The ISS has had staying power, and so will the Gateway if it remains occupied. But if we just go once a year, stay on the Gateway for a few months at a time, and leave everything unoccupied otherwise, this program stands a real chance of getting shut down just like Apollo did. And we can't afford to have that happen a second time. And some of the modifications that I've suggested here, and ones that I'm sure I haven't thought about, could make the SLS more affordable and therefore allow us to go to the moon at least twice a year, maybe 3 times a year, to make certain that we not only keep the Gateway occupied, but also start to expand our presence on the lunar surface and start establishing a base. But none of that is going to happen if we're spending $2 to $3 billion a shot, or $1 to $2 billion, or whatever it ends up being for the SLS, and only go once a year. It just won't happen. And I don't know how many times I need to say that, but I guess I'm going to stop. In any event, if you like content like this, as I say, there aren't a whole lot of people talking about how we could make the SLS reusable. I try to mix things up and have unusual content on this channel, as I'm sure you've noticed. You know how to support me. It's all in the description. Support me on Patreon. Support my sponsors, such as the folks who make this spaceship and also this Crew Dragon. And if not any of that, subscribe, like the video, and help me blow up this damn coffee cup, because no matter what I may have said about the SLS right now, I still want to blow this thing up, and I still despise Boeing, as I think I've made it pretty clear. So until we're ready to make the changes that need to be made in order to actually follow through with NASA's promise to go to the moon, to stay, I urge all of you to stay angry about space.